What a pleasure to be back. I love these forums. I begged to come back to UC San Diego, and when I heard that Kate Boo was going to be here, and we've known each other for a long time, I'll say a few words about Kate, but one of the things I was very proud of is that she was an early senior fellow at the New America Foundation, which I had a role in helping to launch with some other friends, and it became a prominent think tank, but we used to be a small little outfit. And Kate, we were then hoping that we would bring in a few people that were stars. Kate was one of these people that everyone knew would become an extraordinary star in the sense that her dexterity and depth of her writing. We had others in that early crop of fellows at New America Foundation, Margaret Talbot, Deborah Dickerson, others, Gregory Rodriguez from Los Angeles, were extraordinary thinkers and minds, and all of them were very much at the cusp of some of the biggest issues that we were facing in the country at that time. I usually don't praise people, or when I do praise people and say nice things, it's usually setting them up for a down, later. I learned that from Bob Woodward. But I will say with Katherine, I am genuine in saying this. And let me give you a little bit about Katherine's background before we have our conversation. She has done something which many people in political journalism don't. We're going to be talking about her book, of course, Behind the Beautiful Forevers, Life, Death, and Hope in a Mumbai Undercity. And it's one of the most extraordinary books for me because I tend to wonk out on books on political economy. This is a political economy book, the best written political economy book I've ever read in my life. And we talk about political economy, it sounds so sterile and distant in a way, and it sort of protects us to sort of say, we're talking about political economy, but this is a book about people and lives and divides, people that were cast away, left behind. It's also a reflection on those that did the casting away, those that did forget others, those that are in the overcity, wherever that overcity may be in the United States, in Europe, in India, that you wrote about. So she's written a lot in her life of writing about poverty, about divides, about people who have handicaps. She won the Pulitzer Prize. I went onto the Pulitzer Prize website today, and the Pulitzer was given to the Washington Post in the year 2000. For its work at that time on really community houses of those with intellectual disabilities. And it says very bluntly at the top, to the Washington Post, but particularly for the work of Katherine Boo. And so if there was any doubt about who deserved the prize, she did that. So won the prize in 2002. In Japan, where I've done a lot of work, they have a distinction called Living National Treasure. People in pottery and kimono stenciling and all kinds of Japanese arts that it takes designates people who bring the richness of culture and they want to celebrate that, promote that. And in a sense, I think it's a sad thing that we don't have such a distinction in the United States. But I think Kate is one of the living national treasures in writing today with soul. She won the MacArthur Genius Award. Maybe that helps raise and create a profile and a spotlight on those people who are doing extraordinary things that benefit society. But won a MacArthur Genius Award in 2002. And of course, for this book, she won the National Book Award in 2012. And it was picked as one of the very top books, favorite books of the New York Times. And so we're talking to a very special person here today. And I'm really looking forward to it. I've been trying to get this rolling for 17 years, I think. So, Kate, thank you very much for joining us today.
Okay, I just need to say my reporting last week went so badly. You have no idea. So that feels like something that happened to somebody other than me, and I appreciate it.
Let me first poll the audience, because I neglected to mention that Kate is a staff writer at The New Yorker, and I want to make sure I put that on the table because, of course, I'm at The Atlantic. But how many of you subscribe or read The New Yorker? Yay. How many of you read The Atlantic? Yay, we're working on you. We're working on it. So congrats on that.
Thank you.
So,
how many people read the San Diego Union Tribune? All right.
Yay, great.
All right.
Yes, there we go.
It's all about local journalism.
So Kate, let me begin. I mean, I've just reread this book and to come through it, and it's such an extraordinary story. And I just want to know, I want you to share with the audience the whys and the whos. Why did you begin this book? And can you just share with us some of the extraordinary personalities that I want us to all to have a facility with?
Okay, so I think the why of the book goes to when I first met you. I also, that same year, I met my husband, who's Sunil Kilnani. He's an intellectual historian and a patriot, and so all of a sudden, I was spending a lot of time in India, which at the time had a third of the world's poor. And the questions that I was wrestling with in the United States were, what does poverty look like in the global market age? And when I was in India, I thought, well, there was record government spending to help the poor. There was this amazing grassroots movement for transparency called the RTI, which was like FOIA in this country. And all of a sudden, for the first time, you could really look at what was happening, what the government was doing, and how it was affecting historically poor communities. And no one was doing that work. And when you spend a lot of time in poor communities, you develop this sort of gaydar, that's this equivalent of gaydar that, well, you know when you're listening to reporters who are actually doing the work in those communities. And what was clear is that there were so many people who had opinions about what was going on, and not that many people who had real, deeply embedded information. And I thought, well, let me try this. And I set out to do a project that eventually took 4 years of my life and became a real labor of love. But
you set out to map a slum.
Right.
You map the human dimensions of a slum, the economic dimensions of the slum, the police corruption and governance dimensions of a slum. And it's just not something a writer sets out to do every day.
But that's the point, is that so much of what we understand about policy, about economic effects, it's not field tested very hard. It comes from the top. What is the statistic? It's the God shot. And the problem is that we think we know so much about what's really going on in low-income communities that we don't want to invest the time to understand. And if you can shine a light, if you can really spend time listening, like I think if we're going to get serious about poverty alleviation globally, it's not going to happen until we drop kick our stereotypes and start listening harder to people whose lives and our experiences are what our history actually is.
So for those who've not yet read the book, and I hope some of you have, and if you haven't, I recommend so strongly that you do spend some time with this book. And I think it will change you. It's changed me. It's affected me since I've read this in the way I look at people who are having a hard time, as I look at people who are working so hard on the street corners in Washington, D.C., running water on a very hot day to people to get a buck when I throw away something. It's changed me. And I'm saying these things realizing that many of you have not yet read this book, so you may not understand what we're talking about. But as we do to it, I think that one of the things that you do so beautifully is you tell a story through families and characters living next door to each other. And I won't remember them all. You knew, but Abdul, Sanjay, and Sonal, and Fatima. Fatima, one leg, yeah, Fatima, yeah. But the characters run through the whole novel, and while you were there for by my count 3.5 years.
I'm still there, so yeah.
Yeah. So the intense, you were there, and when I read the afterword of this book, what struck me in the tale of the interaction of these people, in the way they lived, the way they died, the way they were jealous of each other, all of this stuff. You were there for most of the things, including the thieving,
right.
Including the police encounters, including some of the horrible reactions to people having died. And so could you just give us 4 or 5 of the key personalities so that we can talk about them within the context of this?
Well, I will say that one of the things that's really important to me intellectually is to have 3 or 4 or 5 characters, because typically there's this, this idea that a reporter goes into a community and picks the most super virtuous or the most super talented person, or the person who's the absolute worst, and tells those stories. But real low-income communities are not like that. They're incredibly diverse, and people are jostling for some of the same things, and they're interacting together, and the only way you can convey what poverty and aspiration actually look like today is to consider it from the point of view of a range of people. So one of the individuals I wrote about was a young man named Abdul Hussein, and he was a teenager. He didn't know how old he was because his parents were so poor, they were so busy when they were growing up that they weren't keeping track of the years. And he, by the time you meet him, is supporting a family of 11, a family as big as a cricket team, buying and selling the recyclable garbage that scavengers, workers, pick up at the international airport in Mumbai. So some of you may have been to Mumbai, and you may have been to that airport. Well, it supports an entire economy of people who take the newspapers and take the empty plastic bottles and sell them by the kilo, and that's what they live on. And when I asked one of the other people in the book, Sunil, to describe Abdul to me one day, he said, he keeps his head down day and night. That was the first thing he said, because Abdul's father was ill and he'd been sorting recyclable garbage since he was 6 years old. And he was this just person in the middle of this open space in the slum who was hunched over garbage, his face in garbage day and night. And part of my work, and part of what I love about my work, is getting to know people who you might stereotype in an instant. I mean, you make decisions about people in 3 seconds. You probably already made your decision up about me before I open my mouth. People make up their decision. They make up their minds about what somebody like that is like in an instant. And what I found once I started listening to Abdul is that he had an absolute ethical philosophy about the value of even the worst life. He was he had this moral dimension to him that even his own family didn't know, because he was the workhorse of his family. And one of the things that I'm trying to do in the work is to not just look at what people do and how they do it, but to take in what people think of the world, and to take in their views, not just of their own so-called plight, but their views of other people, their views of power, their views of beauty. So that when you meet somebody like Abdul on the page, what I'm hoping is that you're not going to see some alien freak. You're going to see somebody who's as complex as you are, because that's what I see in my own reporting, is I'm meeting people who are every bit as complex and problematic and interesting as myself and the people I love. So he's one of the people. And then there's a woman named Asha, and she's in her 40s. She's a mother of 3, including a remarkable daughter who's poised to become the first college graduate in the history of the Anawati slum. And her husband is a thoroughgoing alcoholic. And she's looking around her world, the world, and she says, the government is stealing so much opportunity from low-income people that really corruption itself is the only opportunity that remains. And she determines to give her daughter the life that she didn't have, she's going to work the government programs and basically beggar other people so that her daughter has a chance for a better life.
And she just asserts herself as a fixer.
Exactly, and she wants to be the new slumlord, and she's a woman, and women aren't supposed to be slumlords, but she is smart and she's determined, and she asks an essential question to me that I hope sort of arcs over the book, which is, why is it my corruption when the big people say it's right? And I think that's something we can think about in our own time now, is the message that gets sent from on high, and how people who are struggling take that message.
You know, one of the things that struck me particularly about Abdul Hussein was, when I think back at my friends that when they were his age, I don't know anyone that was as industrious as he was in my life. And so one of the things that was just striking to me was, you've taken us into a completely different world, and you've almost become detached from, the modern, the rich, the wealthy, although it sticks its head in sometimes via movies or the Intercontinental Hotel or various things that you talk about.
The community is surrounded by 5 luxury hotels.
And this kid is, this kid is sorting junk and garbage all the time, and he becomes like the Andrew Carnegie of junk and
Right.
garbage. But there are rivals out there. And so one of the other things in there was just and I think it's one of the things I want to ask you about, insights you've gained about the human condition in people, is that I think many of us have this notion that in small towns where people are poor, impoverished, have trouble, ultimately people help one another. But you see the worst sides of competition, rivalry, and nastiness among the poorest people in the world living next to each other.
And why is that? And
Yeah.
in a slum and in our own communities, it's because there's a decline of permanent work. I mean, this is an absolute crisis. In the slums in India, in this one particular slum, in my surveys, I found that 6 people out of 3,000 had permanent work. And I would go back.
6 people, just want to get...
6 out of 3,000.
Wow.
But then you can say, oh, that's only an India problem until you think about, I mean, you know, the work of Katz and Kreuger at Princeton and Harvard, who took a look at net job growth over the last 10 years, and they found that 90% of it was of the impermanent, non-traditional variety. My friends, I would come back from India, and they'd say, wow, it must be so different there. And I'm like, well, how many jobs have you had in the last 2 years? I mean, if there's any writers in the room, you know that instability is the way of life. But when you don't have that factory floor, you don't have that space where workers are together, learning about each other's families, learning about each other's worlds. When you're in this TaskRabbity, these really non-communities, when you're at the corner as a day laborer, are you going to even know your coworker of the week? Those relationships are going to change, and the difficulty of people sort of organizing and finding their common cause becomes that much more difficult. And I think that's a situation that serves wealthy interests very neatly.
Did some of these families and people you were dealing with, I think about Fatima, one leg versus the neighbors before, as that was building, or as I think it was Cynthia, if I'm remembering the name correctly.
Good job.
Who was a rival of Abdul in the garbage brokerage business, and her family, suffered somewhat because Abdul was succeeding and building trust. As you were injected into this and interviewing everyone, and one of the interesting things, when you talk to Kate and hopefully buy the book later and look at, it's worth going back, if I may say this, because I'm not going to spoil any endings, but go read the end of the afterward, because in that. Kate talks about her method. It's extraordinary. When you read this book, it reads like a novel, but it isn't a novel. Everything is what I would call the hyper multiple interviews. People got tired of you.
Oh, God.
They got bored with you.
They got so, and not even that.
Abdul asked if you were dim-witted.
Yeah, because I would ask the same.
And I'm just wondering, how did you pull this off? Because how did these rival factions not try and begin using you as a carrier for their agendas?
You do have to sort of move around in communities, in any community, not to get captured by one group. But I mean, the rivalry is the story right now,
right.
And it's the story.
It sounds so Games of Thrones-ish.
It is really. It's, I mean, and what do you do if you don't have permanent work? If you're not one of those lucky people who gets that, who are you going to blame? You're going to blame your neighbor who has it. I mean, and you have this, I mean, we don't think enough about the toll of inequality on families, on communities, on, and this sense that, I mean, if you take a community like the one I'm writing about, which is surrounded by wealth, people aren't, people, I'll just give you an example of that community in Mumbai, Anawadi. One of the young men there, who's Abdul's brother Murchi, he said to me one day, he described the setting better than I ever could, really. He said, everything around us is roses, and we're the shit in between, which is a beautiful, my private title for the book was The Shit in Between. But if you think about, my editor didn't like that, but if you think about that.
You got a lot of references to shit in the book, though.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It comes up a lot. But, but to think about it, so he's describing this community, like this home to all his family, all his friends, basically everybody he's ever loved as shit. And I think that tells you some of the damage that gets done in low-income communities in a time of inequality. And here, in the place that the low-income communities then working in DC, people are, you know, they're on Instagram every day just punishing themselves with what they don't have. It's a terrible time. It's a terrible time for people who are on the losing end of this business. They are, and they're looking at the young people are looking at their parents, and in, you know, all across the world right now, in London, where I also work in low-income housing, you know, who are they? They're blaming their neighbors, they're blaming their parents, it's just causing tremendous damage that we don't take seriously as a society because we don't look that close, and we don't want to look that close. We want to have like the, you know, the view like these people do something, and the more that we create these people instead of individuals suffering, complex, hopeful people, the easier I think it is for us to live with these staggering levels of inequality.
Did you ever feel that people were performing for you? I mean, Asha, again, for those that may not know, Asha wanted to become the slumlord, but this was the political operator. I mean, she was going to set herself up to be queen, and she became a fixer in the village when people had problems, and then began essentially taking a piece of the, piece of the action for everything she did. But it occurred to me that you're this famous woman journalist who came in. I'm just wondering whether your presence inspired some of the women to act out or to do certain things they might not otherwise have done.
You know, you never really know how you affect the community that you're working in because there's no control group. So, you know, it's all, this is my speculation, but what it seems pretty clear to me, because I videotape, I can watch.
Right.
Then in the beginning, you have a very stilted relationship
Yeah,
with
you
people.
had an army of videotapers?
No, me.
Oh,
me.
I thought you had another young man who was, or a couple of young people.
I had some translators come in and out, and then one amazing woman, Unati Tripathi, who worked with me for most of the book. But when people are in these situations, you can't pose for the photographs. You can't perform for years on end if you are wanting to give your families a better life in this kind of economy, and this tremendously volatile economy. So eventually people forgot about my presence, but I would say something else that was significant, that people didn't know I was a famous reporter. They didn't have that context for that. But they also thought that a woman whose hand looks like my hand, which doesn't look like other people, like they didn't think that kind of person would be a reporter. So they didn't associate, I don't think they truly believed that I was a journalist until I did a small piece for the New Yorker, and it got translated in a local newspaper in Mumbai, and then they got to read my work, and then they realized that I wasn't, they thought I was like a Christian lady trying to steal children at some point. So, but then they realized, oh no, and I think they felt relieved for me because I wasn't insane, that I was actually doing. I think they sort of didn't know what to make of me, and things got easier after that. But there was still this one guy who said to me, I think like till 2.5, 3 years later, he said to me, I don't want to talk to you because I'm waiting for the real journalist to show up. Yeah.
The other bit of the book that both depressed and amazed me, but it made me think a lot about the United States and what Mike Lind and other people have called the underclass, is the exploitation of them by authorities, by the police, the way in which the police extracted such money and bribes, well, not really bribes, it was extortion from people in need, and created, and basically it was a very corrupt culture with the local police department, and the justice system and the interaction. I mean, I think you're writing about the justice system, the courts, how all of that interacted. The executive authority, the woman that was the executive authority, kind of coming in and kept saying, hey, she would, help for 20,000
Right.
rupees or something like this, that entire culture of web of corruption that sat on top of exploiting the poorest people in India.
It was, one of the interesting things about this kind of reporting is that you find things that you could never have anticipated. And one of the things that I found was that because in other, there was more transparency in other sectors of the society, and that, so for low-income people, they were saying it used to be there was a social contract where an officer would come and take a bribe once a week. And then they said it was, all of a sudden, it was night cops, it was day cops, it was desks, it was, and people were absolutely stunned by this change that happened. But I try also to show in the book, because I try not just to write about people as so-called victims, but I try to write about the people who are doing the damage as well and name their names. That's very important to me. But those people, those officers, those teachers, they were trying to get ahead in this economy. Again, they were, you see it. It's not like the village under Mao. You're seeing what other people have, and you say, why is it that I don't get that too? And I think that it's something that applies in this country as well, is that when licit means of social mobility break down in a society, illicit means are going to prosper, because people aren't going to sit on their hands and give up their hopes for their children very easily. And I think it's something that we have to be concerned about here again.
As you describe, the police and what was going on, I was amazed that I couldn't find anyone's name that you didn't mention. So, and these are real people.
Real people.
Everyone's real
Doing
people.
real crimes,
Everyone's named, and you told extraordinary stories of corruption, of bribe taking, of extortion. Were there consequences of that?
You mean after the?
Yeah.
I think that for individuals.
Officer Thakul, am I saying the name right?
I would say that there were consequences for that police district. But I mean, I'm back there pretty regularly, and there's new things sprout up. It's not like you're like fix it. It's I think that there's this way in which the power of journalism can be exaggerated by journalists to make them feel better about themselves.
Well, the other thing that was striking is, you had the kind of this ecosystem of just nastiness, toxicity, and it was also great humanity.
Yes.
Great humanity, and that's always an important part of the story. And I don't want to get into the great drama of the book, but there was a big
friendship.
collision between families and people and egos, and it was awful. And it led into the court system. And I couldn't tell what you thought about the Indian court system, which seemed to run by different gravity than all of this corruption. It seemed, in a way, to come. So I'm just wondering whether or not you saw it as maybe one redeeming part of the Indian system, that somehow people are protected at some level.
I think the high courts in India are full of some truly great thinkers and reformers, and some of the most hopeful aspects of Indian life come from the courts and their battles. But what I found was that the courts that served the poor there was something called fast-track courts, and I'd heard, because my husband and I know a lot of people in the courts. We'd heard forever that these were huge reforms, that these were good things. But once you go inside the courts, what you find is judges who were running 37 trials a week. It had nothing to do with justice for low-income. I mean, it had nothing to do with justice. It had everything to do with fixing the backlogs of cases. And again, I'm seeing it in my work in the United States too, that so much, like, people are looking for targets and outcomes, and our societies are getting very good at getting the numbers right, while really selling out the people, the capacities of people whose lives are in the balance. And you can't understand the cost of that to a society, the potential that's squandered, unless you pull in close, and we don't do that.
One of the vignettes you talk a little bit about the book, which is fascinating, is this, I think it's a watering hole or a spring or pond.
It's a sewage lake,
Sewage
I think.
lake,
Yeah,
okay,
it's
sewage
a lake.
Excuse me for, glossing over that.
I once fell into
the
it
sewage, the sewage lake,
my
yeah.
legs blew.
So there's this vignette that you shared in your own commentary about what you did, that you actually fell into this, and that your feet came out blue.
I needed to work on my situational awareness. I was
Yeah.
taking a picture, walking backward, videotaping,
And you fell right into the
Right
sewage
into
lake.
it, yeah.
And the sewage lake people collected frogs there, and there were, I guess, fish.
and
occasionally.
they dumped the corpses of their dead animals,
Yeah,
so their
right.
animals would drink from the sewage lake
goats,
and die,
right.
and then they put the animals back in the.
And so people had
sewage lake.
TB and
Malaria.
dengue fever and
Yeah.
malaria and all of this.
Yeah.
So my question is, you're very upfront about some of the health challenges you have. Did your husband think you were crazy? I mean, at some point, did you,
Yeah.
you do tell the story that you're upfront about some of the health challenges
Yeah.
you have, but this was a pit of where many, I mean, I just want to be upfront, many of the people you talked to that you saw interacting died in the short time period you were there. I mean, when you count everyone who died in this book, it's not trivial.
Yeah. That's a deep question, and I would say that my husband understands that if I'm not working and engaged, then I've had autoimmune disease since I was a teenager. So if I'm not working and engaged, I'm sitting around feeling sorry for myself, I get worse. Like what gives me energy and strength is the people that I get to report on, and the sense that I have, I have a job to do, and they keep me going. But I will say that my husband, I got into altercations with the police while I was working there because I was investigating homicides that they had covered up. Because the victims were poor kids, and they just labeled them disease deaths. They didn't feel that they were. And so the police started fighting back once they knew that. And at that point, my husband was like, "Are you sure you really want to do that?" But by that time, he'd also met some of the people that was, in my book, and he understood. It's one thing to think, oh, she's doing the work, and it's one thing to know about the young people who were seeing what it meant to them when their friend gets murdered and the death is covered up. Like, once you see what that signifies to other children in the same situation, that it could happen to them, once you understand the stakes of it, it begins to make more sense as a calculus. And so I think he knew what he was getting into when he married me. And it's not always a picnic, but he fully supported the book and his wife when
As I was reading,
she was in distress.
As I was reading this wonderful book, I know this sounds obnoxious, but I tried to put myself in your role, just sort of seeing a reporting, because I knew you were reporting this. So really, and the people, and just you fall in love with some of these people that are there. So just the question I had is what was the hardest part of this for you? Because these were real human beings who had extraordinarily horrible things happen.
I think the hardest part...
I think the hardest part for me, if I may, is the rat poison, the people that were committing suicides.
Yeah, and the question, there's a death in my book of an amazing young woman. She was of a scheduled caste, the Dalit caste, formerly untouchable, and she decided that her life in marriage would be worse, that it would be better to die than to experience the caste discrimination that she expected to face in a village where she was being married off to, and she methodically prosecuted that decision. And she was just a young woman full of life and energy and humor. And so the question that you have as a writer then is like, can you make people care about it almost as much as, how can you bring the reader in to this tragedy, like what the world loses for losing a young woman like that, and. So you can't just be sad. You have to bring all the energy that you have into bringing those losses alive, and not just, of course, individual losses, but the tremendous social dilemmas that
Was
those
that
losses
the hardest
signify.
part of writing for you?
I think the hardest thing for me was the sense when I was writing that I had this idea that, first of all, that people only wanted to read these books that were about the indomitable human spirit, so that I was telling something that was realistic, and I wasn't sure that anybody was going to care, and so the hardest thing was to try to make, people who don't people who don't necessarily rate in any, in so many of the categories that we as a society think are important. People who didn't necessarily go to school, they weren't necessarily, they had flaws. How to make the reader care about those individuals, which pushed me toward finding a different form for it, a more immediate form, so that you could go directly to the characters. You didn't have to listen to me describe the history of caste or how many islands made up Bombay. Like, you could just get straight to the heart of these individuals who you might not otherwise meet, and then sort of let them take the story.
One of the things I noticed in the book, it was interesting you used the term gaydar a minute ago, is that you had eunuchs in the story. The eunuchs come in and play this unique role that you might, I'd love to hear what you thought. And you had the Hussein family and some others that were Muslim families, largely surrounded by Hindu families, and that had this. But I, as a gay man who was reading this, I wondered, were there any gays in the picture? And I didn't find any of that in the book. And was it not there at all in your observations, or was it there in ways that were pretty, not that it has to be about that, but you had every other dimension. It was, yes, and so and I did write about the hijras, the third sex, who, and the ways in which they were being disenfranchised. They couldn't get the vote because they were, like they were migrants. There were other people who the people who had political power decided weren't worthy of having an equal voice. But these eunuchs, explain what the eunuchs are in terms of, I know what eunuch is, but they seem to have a place in that community. Absolutely. There was, in that community, and different communities have different ideas, but it was that they had been born of sexual uncertainty, which is an elastic category, and that they had so much bad luck that they could come to the door and take your bad luck away. So you always wanted a eunuch at a wedding, so that the bride and groom would do great, and so they had a stature. They were in some senses pariahs, but they also had a power, because if they put their evil eye on you, they could harm you. But in terms of, there were many young children in the slums born girls who identified as boys. But of course, this is an incredibly patriarchal, traditional society. The people, the families would go to great lengths, poor families, to make sure that their children conformed, and it was a small tragedy. And again, when you talk about go back to talking about the courts, the courts are a great force for good in challenging those kinds of hardened gender categories in India. But it's going to take a long time, and as always, and with social change, it's going to be it's going to take the longest time for people, low-income people, and risk and inequality. They're not, it is harder to take a risk when you have less in every regard, and the punishments are harsher in this country as well. I think that the thing that just screamed out at me in this story, and everyone's stories, is just everyone was striving. So in talking about the eunuchs, they wanted to vote, and they wanted to vote. And it was the one thing, illusion or not, Indians, whether they were in a slum or not in a slum, felt like that was their one time they were equal, that they could vote, and that people were keeping them from coming in and getting that vote across a good cross-section. And then there were people who were powerful in the slum who had 2 votes. They were registered with 2 different, so it was, it's again, if you, this idea of we have so many ideas about democracies, our own included, that when you get close, it's a bit more problematic than it seems from a distance. Right, and so there was that, but I think the other thing that just struck me about why this mattered is being on the edge of this global city that was, becoming, the airport was getting gleamier and glossier and bigger, and you had the great hotels and the stories, and all of this was around, as you said, the shit in between all the roses. And it reminds me of that kind of Jeremy Bentham idea that happiness is a function of relative deprivation. That before the go-go times, before the global, the promise of globalization lifting all boats, that may be more illusion than real, that I love this line in there, that people thought they could go from zero to hero, and that anyone could have this, ticket, find the golden ticket somehow to get out of this. So I'm interested in that tension between what's sort of the richness and wealth that's been created around the world, and what this has done to impoverished people, not only in India, but everywhere.
When you're in low-income communities where people can recall what it was like when sort of everybody was more equal in their misery, nobody's longing for that. They aren't really. People get up in the morning and want to feel like they can find that silver thread through that maze to something better. So that a lot of the nostalgia that you might have expected to see about this time before intense competition, it's just, I'm not finding it. It may be somewhere. But in the communities that I'm working in, and maybe people who are 70 have it, but people who are 20 don't. People who are 20 want a little bit of what everybody else has. And again, it's like, if you have a society, which I think we're really losing it, where the springboards work, and you can strive, you can go through the normal channels and make a success of yourself. If we actually lived in functioning meritocracies, that hope might be, pure good, but we don't actually live in functioning meritocracies. We live in societies that are really excellent at rising, taking people who have been born with a little privilege, who are mediocre, and lifting them up, while people of extraordinary talent in low-income communities get squashed out. I mean, our destiny is a zip code in so many ways, as the work of Raj Chetty and others have suggested. As
you've looked at this, and maybe Raj Chetty would be a very interesting person to comment, do you see things improving in India? Or, because you wrote this in 2008, 2009, 2010, so we've had 8 years. What's happened in those 8 years?
No, I think that there's still a long way to go to create a transparent and accountable system of services for people without power. The kind of accountability that our society is not that accountable to low-income people, but it's slightly more. I mean, for instance, in India, right now, people who use the RTI have been, I was threatened personally, there have been dozens of people who were killed for trying to get information that legally they have the right to have. So it's a real difficult transition for the elites to give up that power and information to the citizenry, and it's going to be a difficult transition. But at the same time, when I go to Mumbai, I'm still feeling a lot more hope. And one of the striking things is that nobody in the communities where I work now is thinking, oh, let me go to America. Everybody's like, America, that's finished, that's over, we're in the right place. And, feeling sorry for the Americans who are living in their cars. And feeling terribly sorry for the Americans who get killed in movie theaters by gunmen, or in school. So that's been a really interesting shift, and that's happened just in the last.
When you were in the slum, one of the things that was interesting to me was there was sort of a current affairs literacy that surprised me, or I sensed there was. Is that true? I mean, there seemed to be people talking, communicating, who knew about the movies. There was storytelling was active.
Or they were. I mean, the people who collect garbage, they were intricately linked to the global economy. So when there was the construction in advance of the Beijing Olympics, lifted the price of their waste to record highs, and that was in the beginning of 2008, and then the collapse of banks in
08, 09,
put their incomes in the toilet, and the work that they were doing was the same every day, but the results in this global economy are completely different, and it's true for so many workers, that we tell young people, oh, your economic future is in your control, but That's one of the great lies of our time. And so people had to know what was going on in Wall Street to know what they had to do to feed their families by collecting plastic bottles. I mean, just think of it.
Well, one of the fascinating things, I mean, to give people a slightly big, I mean, I don't think this is giving it away, but Abdul's storage locker, right? Which was he was hoarding certain things until the price went up, right? So he had a sophisticated system of organized garbage that he was holding on to certain things until the price rose. Right. And I think he was devastated after he ended up in the legal system that his younger brother, I guess, was Michi was complete slacker, incompetent, and didn't understand at that time the kind of the way this economy worked. Right. But it just reminded me of something Richard Branson mentioned when I interviewed him once about the kind of people he was hiring, because I said, what about in our court systems, and we're talking about the United States at that time, but of people who've had a bump in the road, who've served time in jail, and he says, Richard Branson says, I hire convicts. I hire convicts that have come out of inner cities, who've learned how to survive in an economy where no one else was helping them, because he says they'll often have better skill sets on understanding how to set something up than would people who've come from like Harvard Business School or something. Now, I don't know if it's true, but that's what he said. But I find it interesting that the industriousness and the organization of these people there during that period of time was there. So as you look at the lessons, you've talked about this book a lot, but as you've gone around the country, and I sort of remember, I was telling somebody today, remembering old San Diego, before you guys had all this gleam come in and these high towers. And I used to come down to San Diego in the 1980s very frequently, and this was a very different area, and it may still be. And I'm just sort of interested in communities around the United States that have grown very, very well, and whether or not we have communities like this one in Anawandi. Is it Anawandi? Anawandi, that are like this, that we may not even be aware of.
Damn straight. I mean, and you think about the housing prices in this community and the growth. And I mentioned, I asked how many of you support your local paper, because what's happening now, I mean, obviously the local news is in crisis, and unless you not just in this time get your New York Times, get your New Yorker, unless you support your local news, there's going to be untold crises in those communities that will never make it onto the public record. And they, again, it's this, what you mentioned, the exploitation. There's going to be exploitation for which there's no possibility of redress without a very strong and aggressive local journalism. I mean, I was just thinking about the San Diego paper did this last month. They did a really good series on wildlife poaching, and how Fish and Wildlife doesn't have the inspectors they're just not staffed to address it. Like, that's one, you think about Fish and Wildlife, you think about what's happening with the environment. There's so much that's going on in this country right now that nobody's looking at except for people with vested interests. And that's a very frightening, very, very frightening situation for our democracy, because it depends on informed citizens. And so I'm really concerned.
One of the things I'm struggling with in this country right now is the increasing zero-sum tension, the sense of a zero-sum competition between different ethnic groups in the United States, immigrants versus non-immigrants, others that kind of pugnacious nationalism. And there's all of that in your story in India.
Right, the
there's
Dreamers
that
and the
political
Chip
party
Kids.
That I can't remember that
Shiv Sena.
How do you say it?
Shiv Sena.
Shiv Sena, which sounds like a kind of nationalist, anti-immigrant political culture that was growing in this group, and the kind of internal tensions that was going on. Do you have any insights from your experience in the slums in India that can help us fix these problems in the United States?
Yeah, let me tell you how to fix it. But I will tell you that what I think. I mean, I'm a reporter. I believe in the division of labor. I believe that there are people who make policy. But one of the things that's really clear to me is that the United States. I mean, both public and privately, we invest less in human capital than 30 OECD countries. We don't really believe in skill development. And that has to do, I think, with, I mean, and it's to our folly. It's absolutely to our folly. But I think it has something to do with how perniciously that low-income people are stereotyped, because there's something about us that, you know, we are so invested as a society for people who have the leisure to come tonight and think about poverty or live in the center of a very expensive city. We have this idea that we're invested subconsciously in the idea that you know, what we have, we deserve, and that our society does a pretty great job of sorting the winners and the losers. But what my work tells me every day is that our societies do a terrible job of sorting the winners, absolutely, absolutely terrible. And that I know that there's just an, you know, that my life is a function of luck, and other people's lives are a function of bad luck. And once we, you know, if we can really see the capacities of people who we call these people, who we call sometimes animals, if any of you read the news today, that, you know, if we start to see who these individuals are, we're going to want to invest in developing capacity. We're going to, you know, we're going to see how much better our communities can be when we do that. It's not just a gift that we're giving to, you know, people who are disadvantaged. It's a gift, you know, it's a gift for all of us. It's a gift to the world.
What a wonderful near way to almost end. Just two just quick questions. Did the community of people you were writing about ever have a chance to either read or have this book read to them?
Yeah, they did. Everybody had the part that was about them. I mean, it's like people anyway. People
Really?
I don't care about my neighbor. I want to read the thing about me.
How did that go?
It went well, but you know, I mean, that's in nonfiction.
Yeah.
Like, you can't, writing about vulnerable people, you need to keep people involved in the process of reporting on what you're doing, because you are, you know, there's an opportunity to do tremendous damage. And you need the people in the community to believe in the project too, and to...
well, it was a miracle, because this was so raw and real that it was, I just wondered what they would have thought.
Asha, the woman who's the picture, she said, "This is my life, why would I lie?" And I think that they didn't think that people, they never think that people in San Diego would be interested in their lives. They told me that it was a bad idea to write about their lives because their lives were boring.
I want to meet all of them.
But you know, people do. I was in Boise last week, and a guy came and he said, it was so great talking to Manju, and I was like, boy, he really took my book to heart. And then I realized, no, he'd gone to the community and met the people.
You're kidding.
And you know,
really?
He had pictures for them, and you know, hung out with them, and had discussions with them about these issues. And I guess
a great opportunity for one of you to start up a business, to create a tour.
Please
go
meet
Manju and Asha.
Yeah. But you know, it's like if you can get that conversation going and get people listening a little harder.
And I can't help but ask, just as we close here, what are you secretly working on right now that you wouldn't otherwise tell us?
I'm working on questions of social mobility in very low-income, high-crime areas of the United States, actually Washington, D.C., where I would have said until last week, a young African-American man had a lifespan shorter than a young man on the Gaza Strip, but that's changed. So, yeah, but what I'm looking at is these sort of underground railroads to the middle class that people in low-income communities are figuring out for themselves when the traditional springboards break down. And it's a book that was started by a tip from a felon who had come out the system, a returning citizen.
Well, great.
We'll see.
We can't wait to read that. Ladies and gentlemen, first of all, Kate, thank you so much. Kate Boo, Behind the Beautiful Forevers, Life, Death, and Hope in a Mumbai Undercity. Thank you so much for sharing this with us.
Thank you so much, Steve. That was appreciate it. Thank you.